All right, here we go. We're back. I think to finish chapter 24, we're nearing the end here. So I'm going to try and get as much done as I can right now. I might backtrack a little bit here. Uh, Stop sharing your flashlight and keep an eye out for trouble, he thought. Disgusted with himself, Gregor swept the beam over the surrounding rocks. Nothing new. Still, he had to get better about being on watch. Howard had said there were tricks to keeping your mind alert. Gregor did his multiplication tables for a while. That seemed to help. Next, he tried to remember the capitals of all 50 states, but that only lasted for, 50 states. Finally, he forced himself to calculate something he'd been consciously ignoring, the number of days he'd been in the Underland. It was almost impossible to figure out. He'd been in Regalia less than 2 days before they'd set sail on the waterway. He was pretty sure of that. He thought someone had said the trip to the labyrinth was about 5 days, then another day or two until he met up with Ripred. 9 days? 10? His family must be a complete wreck. He would be coming home right around Christmas, without boots, forever. Gregor went back to his multiplication tables. When Aries woke up again, there was more raw fish, and then they took off again. They followed the same pattern for a day or two. Gregor sleeping while Aries flew, Aries sleeping while Gregor kept watch, until finally Gregor awoke to the words, "Overlander, we're here." They were not moving. Gregor sat up and rubbed his eyes. The light was brighter than any he'd encountered for days. He slid off Aries' back onto a polished stone floor and looked around. They were in the high hall. It was completely empty. Somewhere, not too far away, he could hear music playing. "Where is everybody?" asked Gregor. "I do not know. But if there is music, there must be some sort of gathering," replied Aries. "I believe it's coming from the throne room." They shuffled along a few corridors and came to the doorway of a huge room that Gregor had never seen before. The floor sloped down slightly, like a movie theater, and was filled with rows and rows of stone benches. The place was packed with bats and humans who were dressed a lot fancier than usual. They held objects wrapped in cloth and tied with ribbons. Presents, maybe? Everyone's attention was on the large stone throne at the far end of the room. Nerissa was sitting on the throne. They'd cleaned her up for the occasion. Her unkempt hair had been worked into elaborate braids and piled on top of her head. A jewel-trimmed gown hung loosely off her bony shoulders. Vicus stood behind her. He was reciting some sort of speech as he lowered a large golden crown onto her head. It was hard to imagine either Nerissa or Vicus looking sadder than they did at this moment. "What's going on?" whispered Gregor. "A coronation. They're crowning Nerissa king," said Ares softly. Lusa had been right. If she died, Nerissa would be crowned and not Vicus and his family, at least not yet. "So I guess Howard and those guys got back," said Gregor. "How else would they know Luxa was dead?" "So it would seem. If Marith had arrived, he would be down in the hospital, but Howard and Andromeda should be there." Gregor looked around the hall but couldn't find them. Vicus finished speaking as he settled the crown onto Nerissa's head and released it. Her thin neck bent forward under the weight, and Gregor thought how ill-suited she was to be queen of this violent warring place. Whether she was mentally unstable or actually could see the future wasn't the issue. The girl was too weak to hold up her head with a crown on it. The image of Lutza shoving her gold band flashed before Gregor's eyes. Whether she wanted to be queen or not, there was no doubt in mind she would have been up to the job, but she was gone now. Gregor was right. They should have made Vicus king. Vicus would make a good leader. He was smart, diplomatic. He did not seem like he would let power go to his head. As Nerissa braced her hands on the arms of the throne and managed to raise her head, her eyes caught Gregor's. Something registered on her face, and then she fainted, dead away, tumbling to the floor. The crown hit the stone with a clank and rolled off. There was a big commotion. A stretcher appeared almost immediately, and Nerissa was carried away. I wonder if she had a vision or something. There was a lot of head shaking and murmuring in the crowd from the Underlanders, who had probably been opposed to Nerissa being made queen in the first place. Then somebody spotted Gregor and Ares. They had been standing in the doorway unnoticed since everyone had been watching the crowning. Now hundreds of faces turned their way and began to shout questions. Gregor could see Vicus waving for him to come down. This wasn't really how he would have chosen to reveal the story about the Bane. He had planned to tell Vicus alone and then head home, but that option was gone. As Gregor and Ares made their way down the aisle to Vicus, the crowd parted and gradually grew silent. By the time they'd reached the throne, it was as if everyone was holding their breath. Greetings, Gregor the Overlander. Ares, we're happy to see you alive. What news do you bring us? Did you find the Bane? We found it, said Gregor. The Underlanders broke into chatter. Vicus motioned for them to be quiet. And did you drain its light? No, we took it to Ripred, said Gregor. There was a moment of disbelief, and the crowd went crazy. He could see the faces, human and battle-like, twist into fury. Something hit him on the side of his head. His hand went up and came away bloody. A small, ornate crystal jar was down by his feet. It must have been meant as a present for the new queen. More objects began to rain around him. An inkpot, a medallion, a goblet. The only thing they had in common was that they were all made of stone. Gregor realized it didn't matter how beautifully the gifts were carved. You could call them works of art, but it didn't change the fact that he and Ares were being stoned to death. Ares tried to get between Gregor and the mob, but it was no use. It was pressing in, forcing the pair up against the back wall. Voices cried out for their death. Gregor remembered Ripred's words, and you know there will be hell to pay in Regalia. The rap must have been a little more specific. Through the crowd he heard a horn blowing, and the crowd was falling back. A ring of guards formed a semicircle around them. They were escorted out of the room. "You will follow," said a woman who seemed in charge, and Gregor did, happy to be getting away from the mob. They went down flight after flight of steps and eventually reached a quiet hallway deep under the palace. The woman held the stone door open for them, and Gregor sensed this was odd. There were few doors of any kind in the palace. He and Ares went inside the torchlit room, and the door swung shut behind them. There was the sound of something sliding into place. Where are we? Is this a special room to keep us safe? It is to keep others safe from us, said Ares. This is the dungeon. We've been placed under arrest for high treason. What? Said Gregor. What for? For committing crimes against the state of Regalia. Did you not hear the charge? Gregor hadn't heard anything but a bunch of people yelling. Oh man, he pounded on the door with his fist. Let me out of here. I want to talk to Vicus. There was no response. He gave up pretty soon since it really hurt to hit the stone door. He turned back to Ares. So treason, huh? That's great. What happens if we're found guilty? We get banished or something? No, Overlander, said Ares. The punishment for treason is death. All right. Chapter 25. Death? Took Gregor a moment to register. You mean they're going to kill us for not killing the Bane? If it is determined it was a treasonous act, said Ares. And who decides that? Said Gregor, hoping it was Vicus. A tribunal of judges. The final sentence must be approved by the queen, said Ares. Well, Lux isn't going to let them. Then he remembered Nerissa was queen now. No telling what she would do. Would Nerissa let them kill us? I don't know. I haven't seen her since I allowed her brother to fall to his death, said Ares. I could not face her. Gregor slid down on the wall and sat clumsily on the ground, overwhelmed. He had risked so much, lost so much for these people, and now they were going to kill him? I'm sorry, Overlander. I should not have brought you back to Regalia. I should have foreseen this would be a possibility, said Ares. This is all my fault. It's not your fault, said Gregor. I thought there was a good chance we would be banished, but then I could have flown you home. I am as good as banished anyway, so what does that matter? But treason? I didn't think they would take it this far. They have never put an Overlander on trial before, and certainly not one so young. Ares began to rock back and forth. He seemed to be talking more to himself than to Gregor. I cannot let this happen. I've already lost one bond, whatever his intentions. It does not change the fact that I let Henry die. I will not lose the Overlander. I will not let him be. Wait! I have a plan. Ares turned to Gregor, his eyes darting around as the plan took shape. I will tell them that this was my idea, that I would not let you kill the Bane. I stole your sword, yes, that'll work, because you came here home without one. And then I forced you to take the Bane to Ripred because I am in a league with the rats. They'll believe this. I am much hated and deeply distrusted already. Gregor stared at Ares in disbelief. Did Ares actually think he would agree to that? I'm not letting you do that. I mean, just the opposite happened. I'm the one who wouldn't kill the Bane. I'm the one who wanted to take it to Ripred. If anyone should be cleared, it's you. But it will not help me, Overlander. I will die no matter what. That is what they want. We may still be able to save you. Think of your family. Gregor did, and it was awful. First Boots, now him. But he couldn't throw Ares to the lions that way. His family wouldn't want him to lie and get Ares killed for something he'd done. No, said Gregor. But you... No, said Gregor, I'm not doing it, Ares. Then we will both die. Then we will. He sat there, staring, both of them stewing for a minute. How do they do it, said Gregor. You will not like it, said Ares. Well, probably not, but I'd rather know. They will bind my wings in your hands and drop us off a very high cliff to the rocks below. It was Gregor's recurring nightmare. For about as long as he could remember, he'd had terrible dreams about it. Well, falling through space, smashing into the ground, it was how Henry had died, and King Gorger's rats. He'd heard their screams as they fell. He had seen their bodies bursting open on the rocks. For a moment he was tempted to take Ares up on his offer, but he couldn't. A small hatch at the base of the dungeon door swung open, and 2 bowls of food were pushed in. The hatch slammed shut. It was impossible to eat at a time like this, but Gregor's stomach began to growl at the smell of the food. You don't want to eat? He asked Ares. I suppose we should keep up our strength. Some opportunity for escape may arise. The bowls contained some kind of porridge and a chunk of bread. It wasn't the most exciting meal on earth, but after days of raw fish it tasted great. Gregor wolfed his down and felt a little better. Just because they were accused of something didn't mean they'd be found guilty. Maybe when the tribunal heard his version of what had happened, they would understand. And then there was Nerissa. So, no matter what the tribunal decides, Nerissa can keep us alive if she wants to? Yes, she can spare our lives, but Overlander, I let Henry die. Yeah, but you know what she told me? She told me she thought it was best he had died, because if he hadn't, then everybody else would die too. Did she, said Ares? It must have taken many dark nights to come to that conclusion. Does she really see things? I mean, like the future, said Gregor. She does. I've witnessed it. But she is young, and her gift is a torture to her. She sees many things she does not yet understand, many things that frighten her. At times, she doubts her own sanity. Gregor didn't respond to that either. He wasn't convinced that she was sane either. The door swung open. The guard stepped in. It's time for your hearing, said the one in charge. His hopes dimmed when they bound his hands behind his back. Ares' wings were pinned against his body with a rope. It was like they were already being prepared for execution. All they needed was the cliff. Several guards hoisted Ares onto their shoulders and marched off briskly. Gregor followed behind as they retraced their steps up several flights from the dungeon and veered off to another part of the palace. They entered a room that was set up for the judgment. This was not the room where the Underlanders had threatened to banish Ares. It was more formal, more official. A long stone table with 3 chairs sat at the front. That's for the judges, Gregor thought. Directly behind the center chair, elevated by a platform, is a throne. Off to the right, as you faced the table, was a stone cube with 3 steps going up to it. It was positioned so that not only the judges, but anyone sitting in the 7 tiers of seats that rose to the high ceilings would get a good view of it. The witness stand. Every seat in the house was filled with either a bat or a human. They stared down at Gregor and Ares with undisguised hatred, but it was eerily quiet. It had almost been better when everyone was screaming and throwing stuff. Gregor was directed to an open area in front of the table. The guards set Ares down next to him. They stood staring at the empty table before them. Then there was the sound of more footsteps. Gregor turned his head and found Howard and Andromeda behind him. They were both bound and looked ragged. What are you doing here? Gregor exclaimed. We too are on trial for treason, Howard said hoarsely. For what? You never even made it to the Bane. That's precisely the reason, said Howard. Then Gregor realized what he'd meant. Howard and Andromeda were on trial because they had not finished their mission. They had not returned to Regalia with Marith. They had returned to Regalia with Marith. But, said Gregor, I made you go back. No one made me do anything. I came back of my own free will. Well, that's not what I'm saying, said Gregor. He was suddenly overwhelmed by the way that his decision had jeopardized the lives of those who had fought by his side. He couldn't let this happen. A side door opened, and an old man and a decrepit white bat entered. A moment later an elderly woman appeared with several scrolls. All 3 took seats at the table. The woman who seemed to be the head judge took the center seat. She glanced back at the throne and addressed a guard. May we expect Queen Nerissa? They're checking now to see if she has regained consciousness, Your Honor. The woman nodded, but Gregor could hear people in the crowd murmuring, probably about the frailty of their new queen. One glance from the head judge, and the room fell silent. Gregor had the feeling that whoever she was, his life was in her hands.